Welcome to Now We're Getting Somewhere. I'm Katie, and I'm a certified life coach, but I've also been a management consultant at McKinsey and a product manager at a tech startup. In other words, I know what it feels like to have a life that looks pretty good on paper, but doesn't feel as good as I want it to. I help my professional clients develop lives that are more meaningful, happy, and also more successful. And I want to share the same practical insights with you. Let's go. Today's podcast is about how to communicate with women. It's advice for men, or especially for men, or anyone who is in relationship with women. I'll say more about this topic before we get into all of it. But first, I want to say that I have a very special guest on today's podcast, a person who I know from personal experience to be a real expert communicating with women. And that is none other than my husband, Gil. Welcome, Gil, to the pod.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start by giving just a little background on this episode and how it came to be and a couple of disclaimers. I have been conceiving of having an episode like this about how to communicate with women and another one, which I'm calling How to Communicate with Men, for a while now. I think at least 6 months, maybe a year. But I really came out of the fact that I was coaching both women and men, and many of whom were in heterosexual relationships. And I felt like there were these really common trends, like men who were in relationships with women were having certain kinds of trouble when they tried to communicate with those women, and women who were in relationships with men were having certain kinds of challenges as they tried to communicate with those folks as well. And there was similar coaching that I was giving to each of these people about how to communicate with the other gender. You know, there was particular coaching about how to communicate with men and particular coaching about how to communicate with women. And they were distinct. And I felt like I wanted to talk about this in the podcast, but I also, if I'm being honest, felt some hesitation in terms of having a podcast episode on this. Like I really held back because I felt like, today's, social, cultural, political climate, sometimes making too many generalizations about how women and men communicate differently might people have feelings about. But I just felt like I was coaching people and I was telling these men so many similar things. And I was telling women so many similar things. And I felt like ultimately it would serve people so much to have these episodes. So I overcame my hesitation. And here we are.
Here we are. Let's do it.
Let's do it. So Gil and I both put together a couple of ideas that have felt true to us about, for this episode in particular, how to communicate with women, advice that would serve men to know, advice that women could share with men about how to communicate with them better. Of course, you can give them this podcast or just share some of the insights verbally with them. And we are going to, we're going to sort of alternate sharing our ideas, and then we're going to chat about them. Okay. Yeah. Let's do it.
Yep.
Okay. So my first idea for communicating with women, especially if you were a man, though obviously I should have said this can apply to all kinds of people, and there's also always exceptions. So if this doesn't apply to you, just ignore it.
I think you covered it. Yeah. We're going to be generalizing, and I think people just have to find a way to be okay with that. It's okay.
Yeah. I have to be okay with generalizations. Okay. So my first piece of advice is she may want to tell you multiple times. She may want to tell you multiple times. I'm thinking of one client in particular who I was coaching a couple of months ago who was having some really challenging conversations with his girlfriend. And he was like, yeah, she was really upset. But then, she told me everything and I listened really well. And then she just told me again. And I was like, why are you doing this? Like, are you okay? Like, I heard you. And a lot of the coaching I gave to him was just like, yeah, honestly, you may have done an amazing job listening to her, but she may just it may take a couple of tries to just kind of get it out of her system. And it doesn't necessarily mean that anything is wrong. And in fact, it would do you some good to anticipate that might occur. Do you have anything you want to say about that, Gil?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Speaking from personal experience, I mean, that's something that you've done. And,
I have told you things multiple times.
Yeah. And that's okay. Having been through it, I think it definitely can be a little bit tough if you're already on the tired side and you're on the receiving end of hearing the same thing multiple times. And of course, we're talking in the context of she has some kind of venting she's doing, or some kind of request, or some kind of explanation of some feeling. And especially if you're on the tired side and you've already been like sort of contributing your time and energy for a little while, it can be like, why are we going over this again? But and we'll get more into this in some of our other bullet points on this, but it's just what's necessary. So just roll with it.
Yeah, sometimes part of the processing is like, yeah, she has told you this, and she may tell you it again. And it doesn't, on some level, the quote unquote rational response would be to just say it one time. But
well, and I think maybe what we're sort of skirting around here a little bit is that the act of saying something more than once isn't really about the thing. It's really, I think, about kind of unloading the emotion underlying what she's saying. So probably she needs to hear herself repeated several times as a way to like emotionally unload a little bit and be able to feel like it's really like coming out of her. But maybe you can tell me more about that, because I'm kind of just putting a metaphor onto it.
I think you're 1,000% right. And I think part of it, and again, my perspective on this episode is that it is for men who are in heterosexual relationships with women, but it's also for women to use to better be able to make requests or explain what they need to their partners. Again, often to their male partners. I find these challenges to be the biggest in heterosexual relationships. So obviously it can apply to lots of people and lots of kinds of relationships. But, as a woman, I think it can be really powerful to say to your partner, if you're in the middle of this kind of thing, I know I just told you all this, but I just want to tell you all these things again. I know that I think just having some self-awareness, so even you can call it out, versus just sort of doing it more unconsciously. Because sometimes maybe the male partner might feel sort of trapped by this, and he might be like, does she not realize that she's already told me this again?
And frustrated.
Yeah. Versus like, I totally know that I've already told you this whole story or all of these frustrations.
Yeah. I think simply saying like, this is helping me to feel better about it. So this is more for me than for you, but thank you for being here and listening to me say it again.
Yeah. I think there have definitely been times in our relationships when I probably told you things 3 times. I've been like, yeah, I know I've already told you this twice.
Sure. Yeah. Possibly more.
I'm going to tell you again. And that, it's not about necessarily communicating information per se, but more about emotional processing. And I think even being able to name that on a meta level can be really helpful.
Yeah. And there's also variations of this where maybe you're actually feeling like the person isn't hearing you. Like they may have heard the words, but they're not really totally understanding why you feel that way. So it's kind of like when people shout or scream when they're in a big argument. I mean, we don't really do that, but yeah, that can just be a normal human reaction. You speak louder when you feel like you're not being listened to. So it's kind of like this is like repeating yourself because you don't quite feel heard, or you do feel heard like you began, and there's nothing really for him to do better. It's just a matter of you need for your own sake to repeat it over and over again.
Well, and it can also be a really powerful conversational move to distinguish, what is happening. Are you telling the story again because maybe he did everything right, but you just want to more release? Or are you doing it again because you didn't feel listened to? And you want to make sure he really gets it?
Right.
And distinguishing really explicitly between the two can be really
powerful. And that requires some discernment on the part of the woman, because she has to be clear for herself of what's going on and why she's doing it. And I'm not going to lie, that can be a little frustrating to be on the receiving end of that. But just shining a spotlight on it, bringing the awareness to, this is what's happening. I understand it may not be totally logical that I'm saying this over again, but this is why I'm doing it. That can make it a lot easier to deal with and just take lightly.
Totally. And we'll move on to your next point, but I just want to give a couple caveats here, which is, we are talking about men and women. I know I've already said this, but it really does apply to any communication you're having with any person. I just think on average, when we're talking about men and women tend to be in certain kinds of roles when you're communicating. Men tend to be in other kinds of roles, though obviously all of this communication stuff applies to everyone. I just want to say that because I think these are sort of broadly applicable ideas. And I want to name, obviously, my coaching is informing a lot of these ideas, as is just like being in a relationship with a person of the opposite gender. Gil is very wise just as a human and very insightful as a human. So that's partially why I wanted him on. And I think he's really good at communicating. And he's like, that's really one of his incredible strengths. And he's really good at communicating with women. So I wanted to have you on for that reason too. So,
I appreciate all that positive feedback.
Yeah. I should have said that from the beginning. Okay. Do you want to give your point now, please?
Yeah. So this is really my first tip. And as you and I were discussing and prepping for the podcast, one of the things we noticed is that you have more sort of like down in the weeds. Oh, here's what can happen when this happens. I have more like high level points, almost more like theoretical principles. But yeah, I think it's good to go kind of between the micro and macro level. So my principle is embrace the vortex.
I love this.
And embrace the vortex refers to that sort of feeling of being pulled into a black hole when, you're having what you thought was a casual conversation, and suddenly you realize that your lady's feelings are triggered, and you can feel that she's beginning to like pull at it, and then you feel this pull of like, uh-oh, this is going to become an emotional discussion. Like, I just got home from work. This is not what I want to be doing right now. Or we just talked about this last week. Why are we talking about it again?
I thought we were just having like a casual conversation over dinner, and then suddenly there's like a charge to it.
Right. And a very amateur move is to just be like, oh, I didn't mean what I said. That's not what I said. Right. Because maybe you said something that had either was completely true or had a grain of truth in it, or maybe voiced some anger or upset that you didn't really want to directly bring up because you didn't want to have an emotional conversation, but it slipped out. And now you want to claw it back, but it's too late, right? You've been captured by like the gravitational pull of that feeling that you've triggered. So now, so this is where I come in with my advice, which is like embrace the vortex. And I don't mean just in that particular moment, but just in general, when this kind of thing happens, like, if you care at all about your partner and you give a shit about the health of your relationship, you can't just be like, let's talk about it next week. Or, I mean, of course, there's always exceptions. You can always say, look, I just had the worst day of my life. Can we talk about this tomorrow? Or can we talk about this in 2 hours? But just understand, if that's your MO on a regular basis, you can't have a healthy relationship, because like your wife, partner, or girlfriend, whatever, is going to keep feeling like she's not being attended to. And, like, relationships require maintenance. And this is one of the main ways that you can serve the relationship, is be willing to go into the emotional vortex and understand that a lot of that pulling that you feel is really just your own resistance to going right into the problem, right? If you just allow yourself to just like allow the conversation to go directly to it, allow yourself to accept that you might be here for an hour, maybe longer, or just allow yourself to accept that you're now in an emotional conversation and you're no longer in control. Not to say that your partner's in control, but like there's an emotional thing here that needs to happen. So embrace it. You're not going to get out of it, because even if you can manage to convince her to like not talk about this second, it'll come up later. And again, this act of constantly delaying these types of conversations is just going to foster resentment and grievances. So embrace it. And I think what you'll find, especially the more you do this, is if you just go right there, this is how you clear up, gunk and muck that's in the relationship and that's accumulated. And of course, if this is very new to you and you're not used to doing this, it's going to feel really icky and difficult at first. But the more you do it, the more you clear up. And it does have a compounding effect,
Yeah.
Like if you have like 10 of these conversations over a period of a few months, each conversation will probably be a little bit easier. And eventually, it's just like, oh yeah, she's upset about this. I need to just be here 100% fully present, really give her my attention. and have an honest reaction of my own, not pretend like I wasn't mad about something, because she can feel it. So this is also an opportunity for me to talk about something that might be bothering me. And you'll clear it up, you'll resolve it, and then other things will come up. In fact, that's my second point, which I'll preview really quickly, which is you'll never be done putting out these little fires, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah, I just love this point. And when you came up with this vortex concept, the first time I heard this from Gail was last night as we were talking about this podcast. I was just like, wow, I think that just describes this experience of what can happen in a relationship, that like suddenly you think you're talking about something and then suddenly something gets triggered and like emotions raise. And like, I think especially like watching men, there's sometimes this experience of like, oh shoot, didn't mean to do that. Oh no. Like, and like now I don't really want to have this conversation. And I just think it is kind of like this vortex that pulls you in, and you can spend so much energy trying to avoid the vortex, or you can kind of just like surrender to it. And sometimes it could actually be resolved pretty quickly if you like fully surrender to it.
Yeah.
To be not that doesn't mean like surrendering to your female partner. It just means like surrendering to being in a conversation about this issue.
Surrendering to the fact that there's a thorn in the relationship in that moment. And again, look, people are free to do whatever they want. Like if you don't want to deal with your partner's feelings, okay, fine, don't. But be prepared for that either to fester into resentment or coldness, or be prepared for her to just pack it up one day and be like, I'm done with this. Like, if you're not willing to like talk to me and, you know, until things are resolved, then like, why are we here? So
yeah,
none of this is like, you have to do anything. This all assumes that you want to have a healthy relationship.
Yeah, totally. And you didn't talk about this concept, but we have a concept that we often talk about in our relationship about like cleaning the pipes, just that the pipes can sometimes just get gunked up. Yep. And part of relationship maintenance is just like, you will always be degunking pipes.
Yep.
So like sometimes it's just like, oh man, I did not mean for something to get down those pipes tonight, but yeah, there we are. Yeah. Well, also, is this a moment for you to share the thing about responsibility you were sharing earlier with me?
Yeah, I think that applies to a lot of different perspectives, but in general, you as the guy may have done nothing wrong, and it could be that your partner is dealing with something that doesn't even have anything to do with you, but just because it's not your fault or you didn't do anything wrong doesn't mean that you can abdicate your responsibility. So it may not be your fault, but it's your responsibility as the partner. And again, because we're generalizing about sort of gender patterns, as the male partner, it's your responsibility to be there, to help support her in figuring out what she's feeling and why and what this means. And I know you have another sort of point about that, about how to be helpful, but yeah, you have to be willing to do that, because that's one of the greatest gifts you can give your partner, is to just be there with her as she's like figuring these things out. And number one, it's going to generate a lot of goodwill from your partner. She'll really appreciate that, you know, you're providing a safe space to do that. And it just shows a willingness to like go through unpleasant things in your relationship. And I think that builds a lot of relationship strength. And it probably gives her a sense that she can trust you. Like she doesn't have to, you know, I think when women become cold or resentful, it's often because they don't have the feeling that they can trust you with their vulnerability. And so they just keep it to themselves, and then they resent you and they act coldly towards you.
Well, and literally we were discussing this before bed last night, and you said something, we were talking about the vortex, and you were like, yeah, you know, it's a vortex. It's not your fault as a man, but it is your responsibility. And I just like, it just landed so profoundly in my body when you said that. And I had this whole flash of insight where I was thinking to myself, and I told you this earlier today, I was like, wow, this is why I have a happy marriage, because my husband believes this. That he believed that it is your like responsibility within the relationship to be present to the vortex. Like I mean, hopefully I also bring positives to this relationship, but truly there's a world in which like 90% of what's good about our marriage is simply just because you believe that. I really think.
Yeah. And I just want to do a quick side note of clarification so people don't misunderstand. This has nothing to do with like, I know that in some circles, there's this, especially religious circles, there's like the concept of like the man leading the family or whatever.
Yeah.
It's not what we're talking about, whatever your opinions on that are. And that's not what we're talking about. It's more like you could substitute responsibility. You could substitute the word, gift for responsibility, right? If you care about your partner and you want to have a healthy, connected relationship that's not festering with resentment and coldness, like this is the single biggest gift you can give her. So you can avoid it. You can say, I don't want to deal with it, which is an amateur move and frankly a weak move, or you can just like embrace the vortex and help her deal with it. And that will really, I can't overemphasize enough how much that will generate goodwill from your partner.
Oh, yeah, I'm obsessed with this one. Okay. So my second concept was she wants you to be a empathetic co-detective. So she wants you to be an empathetic co-detective. So when I say that, like a co-detective and empathetic, I'm sort of referencing that I think a very stereotypical male move in a relationship when there's conflict or like an emotional conversation is maybe the more quote unquote problem solver role, which I think a lot of us are probably familiar with. Your partner's having a problem, you're suggesting solutions. And there's I think, at least some women are decently aware of this idea of like, thank you so much, honey, but I don't actually need you to solve this problem. And I think it's often true that many of us just want really empathetic listening. But I think taking it even a step further and saying, especially if you are a man, it's not just that it would be appreciated if you were an empathetic listener, though I think it typically would be very appreciated if you were an empathetic listener. But I think if you're interested in taking that even a step further and turning your empathetic listening into being a kind of co-detective, because hopefully the woman speaking is also trying to be a detective of her feelings, but you taking on this detective role to help her understand more deeply than she could on her own how she is feeling about a situation, that just becomes incredibly powerful and hopefully gives you actually something to do in the conversation so you don't feel like you're just trapped in listening. And I want to give some examples of what this could look like. It could just be that she's sharing something about how she had a really hard day at work and how she's really frustrated with her colleague. And you're like, oh my gosh, it makes total sense that you would feel that way because also you're so nervous about this upcoming review that you're about to have with your boss, and she might be like, oh my gosh, you're right. I am really upset about this. That is part of the one confounding factors. Like that is why I'm so frustrated with my colleagues. So it's like listening empathetically, but then also adding little bits and bobs to help her understand how she might be feeling. And she might be wrong. You might sort of be like, well, do you think that part of why you're so anxious about going home for Thanksgiving is because, you're afraid of also being judged by your sibling? And she might be like, oh, no, that's not it. But that even you just saying that, giving her something to react to might make her say, no, it's not about my sibling. It's about me not living up to what I always dreamed of for myself. But just giving her something to kind of bounce off of, being involved empathetically, but then also sort of being this co-detective to help her understand better than she could even on her own, kind of like what she feels about a situation.
Yeah. Do you think you could say something about I think I understand it, but for the audience, something about how that's different? Because I can imagine some guys listening to this and saying, well, yeah, that's what I try to do. I try to help her. Then she says she doesn't want my help. So how is that different, that co-detective role, than a guy who's like, well, here's what you should do, that feels more like explicit directions as to what you should do?
So I think it's not about solving any problem, right? Because a detective just wants to know who did it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I say a detective. It's not like a solution person.
Mm.
It's more about like part of what's happening, of course, is a processing of feelings, but typically also what's happening is just understanding really profoundly what the factors are that even cause us to feel this way.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of one of the amazing things that can happen when we have these kind of like emotional conversations, which could be about something outside of the relationship. It's about some stress at work or some stress in the larger family unit or something. Or it could be about something between the two of you. Like you're helping perhaps her discover more about, why she's so frustrated when you don't take out the trash.
Mm-hmm.
She thinks maybe it's just because, I don't know, because she really wanted you to do that thing. And you're like, well, do you also maybe not feel respected?
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, oh my gosh, I do not feel respected. That is part of the problem. So just like helping her understand more deeply than she could on her own by being really curious and asking questions and offering ideas, which may or may not be right.
Yeah. And one more thing I would add to that is for the guys, if check into your motivations. If you're feeling motivated to help her so that you can stop having to listen to her feelings, you're more likely to come across as like doing the classic helping thing, which doesn't really help. But I think if your motivation is really to try to understand and help her figure out these feelings, I think whatever you do will be more likely to come across as actually like what's needed.
Yeah, if it's more just a supportive, empathetic space.
Yeah, because I think it's very common, and I've done it too in the past, where like I think I'm being helpful, but really my deeper motivation is like I need to go do something else, and I don't want to be dealing with this right now. So
yeah, love it.
Okay, so I have my second point is, again, these are very kind of pretentious sounding, but I like to try to encapsulate a lot of different things in a simple statement. So she knows the way to happiness, but needs your support to get there.
Ugh.
And so what I mean by that, and this is like a very subtle thing that I sometimes have a hard time verbalizing, but women in relationships are generally the canary in the coal mine. They are much more likely to feel more aware of things that aren't going right. They're, I think, much more sensitive to being unhappy. I think men, on average, are more likely to just trudge along for a long time being unhappy or just, sort of neutral. And I think most women, especially women that are sort of like living their best lives in most respects, they're going to pick up on something that's wrong in the relationship much more quickly and earlier. And so this is a way of saying, I think women have a sort of more sensitive compass to happiness. They sort of know how to orient themselves towards what's wrong so that they can feel happier. And that's a real gift to the relationship, because in that way, she can be sort of a guide as to like what needs to be dealt with in a way that, men are very good at repressing, and men are very good at, just getting on with things. And in certain situations, that's absolutely a virtue, right? In an emergency situation or in a situation where you have no options and you just have to keep doing the one thing, even if you don't want to do it. But in terms of relationships overall, over the long term, that's not a good thing. And so really embrace your partner's role as sort of the detector of what's wrong, and then know that your role is to help her. And that's when we get back into the whole embrace the vortex thing. Not that everything that comes up in a relationship has to go through like a whole big, huge emotional discussion, but really support her in trying to figure out what's not making her happy or what's keeping her feeling stagnant, because that will benefit both of you. And I guess this is a highfalutin way of saying happy wife, happy life. I think the reason that, again, if this doesn't apply to anybody, you can ignore it. Like, I'm perfectly comfortable making certain generalizations. I think men, if they're surrounded by a happy partner who's like thriving in life, whatever problems they have of their own will seem smaller and will be more bearable. And then the wife can help them with their own things, which is a whole other topic that men, I think, need to learn to be more open and vulnerable with their struggles and not be so afraid that they're going to be judged or looked down upon. And I think a happy partner not only will sort of alert you to what you need to do to help her, But she'll also then be in a great place to help you, because women are good at figuring out what's wrong so that they can be happier. And they're less willing to put up with unhappiness. And in the short term, that's annoying because like sometimes you just don't want to deal with it. But in the long term, that's absolutely a good thing. That's like one of their gifts. And so let her be the leader for how to be happy in the relationship.
I love having you on, Go, because I feel like these are such deep points that people of both genders would benefit from. Like, I think there are probably a lot of women listening to this who have shame or pain over feeling like they, maybe their partners feel like they have too many complaints or criticisms or just like feelings. And they feel embarrassed by it, or maybe for all kinds of reasons, maybe how they grew up or whatever, felt like they shouldn't have too many feelings or whatever. And ditto, I think there are probably a lot of men who are like, oh my gosh, my wife and her feelings. And I'm not that you never feel that way either, but
sure.
But also having a perspective, at least some of the time, which is that same maybe sensitivity to things being wrong or sensitivity to things being off or less than happy, which can make my wife want to have more intense conversations or more feelings conversations or whatever with me. That can be a real blessing to our lives and to our relationship because of her attunement. I mean, again, that blesses our lives, I feel, your and mine, and that you could have that perspective. And it can be it could be a total game changer in a relationship.
Yeah, I mean, this, and I have to keep going back to this because I know not everyone is the same, and some people's ideal for a relationship may be different than ours, for example. But I think people often have a low bar for what relationships can be like. And they think, well, I'm going to take what I can get. I can't have too many feelings. I can't have too many emotional discussions. Both because they think it'll just be too much and they'll like break the relationship, or frankly, sometimes they've tried to ask to have their needs met, but they haven't gone about it in a very skillful way. So maybe it's become nagging, or it's become, because men obviously hate to be nagged, or they've become like really inflexible and demanding. Like there is a place for very clear demands and boundaries, which we'll talk about too. But in general, you've just sort of lost hope. And again, I would say to the men, really, if you feel like you're in a relationship that's gotten very cold and full of resentment, really ask yourself, if you thought there was a way through, do you want to be with this person, essentially? And if you do, then put in the effort, because if you do put in the effort, you'll get a lot more out of it than you put in. But it does require that you be uncomfortable and be willing to grow, and to the women that want to have a better relationship and know that that's possible, like, set that bar for yourself, and then you can figure out how to get there. But don't assume that there's something wrong with being unhappy or, wanting more, because this is more about the men and
we have another
men
episode
how to approach the women. I would say to the men, take it seriously. Like, what does it say? If I think that my wife is constantly unhappy and she's got, just this sort of pessimistic outlook either on me or the relationship, okay, how have I contributed to that? How have I made her feel ignored or not valued? If I'm working all the time and I'm never actually taking the time to spend time with her in a like really genuine way, why would she be happy? Why would you want to be with a partner who's never around? Now, again, if you're like married to Elon Musk, who's, priority number 1 to 10 is like his business and his companies. Maybe that's okay. Maybe you're just happy to like be the wife who, he has a date with occasionally and he sees you once a week, and that's fine. But again, if that's not the vision you have for yourself, then like, demand better. Set the bar higher.
Well, and again, to just return to this great point which you had before we move on, that your wife or your partner, female partner, your girlfriend's dissatisfaction is not just her being high maintenance or annoying or complaining, but could be a sign that something is out of alignment in your lives and your relationship.
You summarized it perfectly.
And that there's an opportunity for you both to come back into alignment by following what that compass is telling you.
Yeah. And just one quick thing on that. And I would say that as men, you're probably likely to think what you might be inclined to think as high maintenance or just like needing a lot of attention could be you're the one who's ignoring something that requires looking at, and you're the one who's missing an opportunity for growth. But that's a blind spot for you. So just really take seriously if your partner is really unhappy. Not that that's always true. Sometimes a female partner can be unhappy for reasons that have nothing to do with you.
Absolutely, yeah.
But just really take that seriously. And of course, this doesn't mean you have to fix it per se, or that it's your responsibility to fix it. It is your responsibility to like listen and be there and just look. Take a look.
Yeah. Team, I just want to say, sometimes I tell Gil that I think he should be a life coach. He's not interested, but he's obviously very insightful. Just fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So my point number 3 was men. You are allowed to say, I can't do this right now, or put boundaries around what you are and are not capable of. But I would recommend stating those boundaries really explicitly and compassionately. I think I want to share this point because, first of all, I think it, sometimes, especially if you are a man in a relationship with a woman, there could be a moment when feelings come up and you just do not have the capacity to be present to those feelings. So I think I want to affirm that you are allowed to have boundaries around this, but I also want to encourage really clear communication about this, because it's a very different thing to just shut down the feelings conversation. Again, whether it's about your feelings about your relationship or just feelings in general, like you don't have time or energy to listen to your girlfriend, have feelings about her job. It's a very different thing to just shut it down in general, or sort of like sneakily avoid the conversation, avoid the vortex just by sort of, shutting it down in your conversation and body language. Versus saying, you know what, I'm feeling like there's a conversation here. I'm feeling like you need my attention. I want you to know I'm hearing that. Is it okay? Or I feel like I really need to take an hour to just decompress because I'm totally exhausted. Can we talk about this later tonight? Or this night is just, I am totally spent. I had the worst day at work. Can we make sure to talk about this tomorrow? I want you to know that I'm here for you, but I just can't do it right now. So it's both, you're allowed to have boundaries, but the relationship will be served if you name that you're feeling that pull of the vortex, that there is something there and you're seeing it too. And also clearly when you are going to talk about this.
Right. Because you're not expected to be like, again, Mr. Fix-It and to be emotionally available all the time, clearly. And I think that's a very common dynamic where like, the woman needs the guy to just be present for her feelings, discussions, and he's just overwhelmed. And I think that's the biggest reason why a lot of men try to escape the vortex. I totally get it because, they have this ingrained habit of just like repressing feelings and uncomfortable things that come up with, of course, anger is usually the only emotion that you're comfortable expressing. So you oscillate between sort of neutral and kind of just gritting your teeth and getting through things, or just you explode in anger sometimes. And the problem with that is it's not a very skillful way to be in the world. And so no one's expecting you to be perfect and be emotionally available perfectly all the time. But like you said, you have to name it. Otherwise, it just feels like you're shutting it down and you're not willing to put in the time and effort.
Yep.
Okay. So you want to go to my next one?
Yeah, let's do it.
This is my third big tip for men. And again, all these sort of overlap with each other and are connected to each other, which is you're never going to be done putting out fires. Now, on one hand, there is a sort of infinitude to that statement, which is like, if you think you're going to get to a point where you'll never have conflict with your partner again, that's probably never going to happen. Because you're human, she's human, nobody's perfect. And there's just going to be moments of just like unawareness of yourself or unawareness of what you're saying and doing. And there's going to be some upsets, and that's perfectly fine. And I say this for both men and women. Like, it's not like the men have to like be on perfect behavior and to make sure not to upset, their partners. Both partners will do things to upset each other. It's just that, like we said, women are much more likely to bring up things that are not right or that need resolution. And so that's never going to stop. However, as I also said earlier, things get much, much better. And so I think there's relationships where there's like nothing happening, no kind of dynamism, just sort of a quiet, neutral, some sullenness that permeates the relationship. And then maybe once a year, there's like a huge forest fire where everything seems like it's going to burn down. And then at the last minute, you just manage to save it. And you're like, oh my gosh, what happened? That was like insane. And then we better not talk about this again, or we better not go on this type of vacation again, because that was horrible. Hope I never have to deal with that again. And then like another year or two passes, and then there's another huge forest fire. And what I'm offering here is that if you embrace the vortex and if you take your partner seriously and you're willing to have those tough discussions, the more you do it over time, you're constantly putting out these very, very small fires, right? It's at first they become just brush fires, then they become just like a fire in the campground, to just stretch the metaphor as far as possible. And then it just becomes like the fire. Then it becomes like when you're roasting something and then there's a little bit too much fat and suddenly you get a little, big flame that comes out and immediately goes away. So it's not that this work is ever done, but it does become much, much easier, and it just becomes a routine part of maintenance. Just like, if you have kids, they're occasionally just going to get on your nerves, and like, you don't expect that to ever be over, but it's not a big deal. It's just kids. That's what happens. And humans being imperfect as they are, there's going to be feelings, and there'll be discussions about feelings, and then there'll be a resolution. And what you're doing by doing that is you never let it get too big, and you're just building goodwill. You're making your partner feel like you're someone who can be trusted to, to give you the benefit of the doubt, to assume good intentions on your part, and that they can be trusted to just help you feel safe in your emotions.
I love it. Yeah, I think I'm so glad you named this one, because I think that among men who I coach who are in relationships that have become challenging over the years, especially longer term relationships where there might be a lot of buildup resentment, there can be a real avoidance of having these conversations, because there is this sense of like, we don't do it very much, and then there's just a forest fire and it's like too much, versus if I can coach them to eventually have this attitude of, this is just something I do, this is my ongoing maintenance, then it doesn't have to be so bad. But at first it might feel like a lot because you didn't do it for a while.
Yeah. And you might have like a great fear of what's going to come out, because there may be there may be years of resentment. And you're just going to have to like sit in that fire is going to burn hot, and it's going to burn longer, but there's no way out except through it. And yeah, I mean, we also have to acknowledge here, like, not every relationship is going to last forever. Some people are in bad relationships, maybe even dysfunctional relationships. And, every case is different, and people are different, but on some level, you have to be willing to find out, is this relationship for me or not? Because if it's not, what's the point in avoiding it? And if it is, and you're both goodwill people with similar values and similar kind of objectives in terms of what kind of relationship you want to have, yeah, you'll get there. It just requires work. That's all. There's no reason that it can't work. But you have to kind of be willing for everything to like drop, and some things will break, some things won't break, and some feelings will be hurt, and some things will become clear. And that's literally the only way to do it. And some people may and should get professional help to help them work this out.
Yes.
Not everything can be resolved on your own.
Absolutely.
We all have blind spots and limitations.
I love it. I think the last point I just wanted to share, which is just a thing that I have noticed myself saying to a couple of my male clients who, again, find themselves in situations where they are having big feelings conversations with their female partners. It feels like a lot. They're feeling like, they have so many feelings. What am I supposed to do with this? And I have often pointed out to several of my male clients, you were attracted to these women often because they were dynamic. That it was they were passionate and full of life in all of these positive ways, and they're so interesting in the world. And those people who are filled at times with really positive emotion and dynamism, when they feel badly or negatively or are in conflict with you, they may have big feelings in that direction too. And of course, this applies to people, again, not just women, people of all genders, but I just have found that there are certain men at certain points who have to be reminded of that it goes both ways. And that same dynamism, the dynamic nature that you might love when it's in a positive direction, can lead to someone having negative emotions that might be bigger than yours and more dynamic than yours. And that's not necessarily, that's just sort of part of the complete package. And that's not necessarily a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's really important. And I want to tie that into just sort of a closing statement for the men, which has to do with like, why put all this work into it, right? What do I get out of it? Just sounds like a lot of work for me right now. Well, and then keep in mind, of course, we have the other episode, which is about the reverse. Yeah, men like women because women generally are more delighted by life. Women delight in like perfume and scented candles, and they delight in, soft textures. And I know women can be neurosurgeons and CEOs and an astronaut. We know that. Okay. But the essence of like why men are attracted to women, right?
They also might just delight in a fabulous TV show or in going skiing. Like it doesn't have to be just scented candles, but I hear what you're saying. I like a good scented candle.
I know you get it. I know we have an audience that might need a little bit more, subtle, discerning explanations. But the point I'm making is that I'm talking to the men, and the men are not confused. The men know exactly what I'm talking about, right? That same sort of delight, like when men go out to dinner and their partner's like delighting in the food and the wine and, and the dresses in the shop or whatever it is, just to have a very stereotypical sort of description here. That enlivens you. That makes you feel good. That makes you attracted to her. Like those are all things that men love and appreciate about women. And as you just said, that same kind of energy can feel like sort of out of control and unregulated and kind of like, and it's not totally in her control or your control. Like that same energy kind of like can go in the other direction. And so that's why it seems like sometimes women can have, like outsized reactions to things that you don't think are a big deal, but like embrace it. That's part of the package of like why women are great. And then the other thing is, yeah, I feel like I've gotten so much out of my relationship by putting this work in because number one, if you're happier, I'm happier. And I'm talking to Katie now. And again, I can't overpraise the sense of like generating goodwill, right? Like you trust me and you trust my decisions. Doesn't mean you don't question things or you don't push back, but like you generally trust my decisions. You generally trust my my sense of what's right for me, even if you would have done it slightly differently. You don't give me a hard time about playing video games. You don't try to tell me how to live my life, and vice versa. Of course, we have this sort of mutual trust, and I cannot overemphasize enough how much listening and being attentive and putting time and effort into maintaining a relationship just makes your life so much better and happier. So it's not about doing this because it's your obligation as a man or anything like that. It's not about old-fashioned values. It's about just a simple recognition that you have a gift to give, and the greatest gift you can give is your attention and time. And you'll get that back twofold.
I love it. Yeah. And I think, having a relationship that has a lot of goodwill in it is such a valuable, meaningful, satisfying thing.
Yeah.
And especially, I mean, we have had a really tough couple of years. And I think having a relationship that went into it with a lot of goodwill, and I think you and I, and we've talked about this together many times, I have not been at our best the past couple of years. It's been some of the most challenging of my life.
We should also clarify that it has to do with our kids' medical issues.
Yeah, and developmental issues, which I've referred to on this podcast a little bit, but it's not it's not about like conflict between us. It's just been a really challenging time in our lives. Right. And just some other, things as well. Renovation was very tiring and other things, but mostly the medical developmental stuff. And so, having a relationship which is a source of safety and support in the middle of that was very, very, very useful and powerful.
Absolutely. So that's the answer to why put in all this effort? That's why.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I'm going to close this out on this podcast. I want to name that this podcast, as I said, is about how to communicate with women. It's for men in particular who are in relationship with those women, but theoretically anyone else who benefits from this kind of ideas. Again, we're not going to confine ourselves just to men. The next episode, which Gil and I are just about to record, but we'll release 2 weeks later, will be the opposite. It's going to be about how to communicate with men, advice for women or for anybody else who wants to communicate with men. So we're not just putting everything on the men.
Yep.
And I want to say again, I hope this is helpful. I hope this applies whenever we are making generalizations about a gender. I just felt my body at certain points in this podcast being like, oh my gosh, it's not going to apply to everyone. So, take what resonates, ignore what doesn't. Obviously, we're trying to make generalizations to help, not to confine you. But we hope this was of service. I think we had some really great points, especially you, Gil. And
I learned from the best.
You learned from the best. And stay tuned for our next episode. Take care, everybody. We're rooting for you, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Bye.
Bye. If you really want to change in a meaningful, lasting way, that's when you need a life coach. Every client I've worked with has had incredibly personalized reasons why they're in the tired or anxious or stuck or uninspired state they're in. Working with me can help you identify those roadblocks, which are usually blind spots that you genuinely cannot see, and implement a profoundly customized, doable plan for overcoming them. I have a very small, high-end, one-on-one coaching practice. If you'd like to be my next client, reach out at katiesiever.com. I'd love to meet you.